Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. The last speaker mentioned a few very, very interesting points about import regulations. What I want to do is I actually want to take the opposite side of the equation. I want to look at what does it mean? What do food regulations mean for exporters? Because we all know in this room, the more exports we have, the greater the need for logistics and logistics services. So really, that's what I want to look at. If we look at food trade, what we find is that over the last 50 years, the production of food has only doubled. What I've done there is I've actually used a log linear scale on the vertical axis in order to highlight the red axis, which actually shows that food production has doubled. But if you look at the level of food exports, actually the level of food exports has increased by more than 10 times, all the way down from 1960 all the way down to 2010. So one of the things we actually know is that food exports are increasing tremendously. If we look at the ratio of exports to production, we find that that's actually increased now to about 15 times the 1960 level. So over a 50-year period, we find that exports are becoming far, far more important, or exports of food are becoming far, far more important than the production of food. Now, what could these reasons be? Well, before we get to that, let's see some of the composition of trade of food. It's actually quite interesting. We find that aqua-based or fish-based products are fairly constant. The real growth has actually been in cereal-based products, in meat-based products, fruit and vegetables, coffee, teas, and of course beverages. These have seen very large growths. The rest, the level of growth or level of food trade has actually been fairly consistent, not substantial. Now, if we look at the world distribution of land, it's actually very interesting. There's very little scope for any expansion in the amount of land. We know we've got Palm Dubai, yes, we know, but it's a very expensive place actually to do agriculture, right? So in terms of as far as agricultural land is concerned, it's fairly limited. Only about 1.5 billion hectares of land, or 12% of the world land mass, is actually used for arable land. There is a lot more land, but that's actually protected for environmental reasons, for forests, for tribal lands, etc. So what we actually find is the bulk of the world's land mass, or arable land mass, is highly concentrated. It's highly concentrated among 7 countries. Now, on this graph, what you actually find, and this is actually 2009 data, but it's changed very little since then. We find that on a per capita basis, we have a number of countries which are food surplus countries, Australia being the main one, Kazakhstan, which is the world's 9th largest landmass country, Canada, Niger, Russia, Argentina. A lot of the landmass countries seem to be in South America, or also North America, Canada and USA being one of them, and some of the large countries in Africa. What we find is the food deficit countries tend to be very different. If you look at the right-hand side, you find the food deficit countries. Of course, Singapore, one of the most advanced countries in the world, but highly dependent on food imports. And then it's no surprise to find, on a per capita basis, all the GCC countries there. Saudi Arabia, not so much, but we find UAE, we find Bahrain, we find Kuwait, we find Qatar. These are all very important countries as far as food imports are concerned. And again, it's not a surprise because only 1% of the GCC landmass is arable land. Only 1%. So it actually is natural that you would expect the GCC to be food importing countries. If you look at the world's exporters, the largest exporters, or the 10 largest exporters are there, of which the 5 biggest are, of course, the 27 EU countries, which work as a bloc, the USA, Brazil, China, and Canada. So what are the trends? What are the reasons? What are the drivers for the exports of food, or the world trade in food? The first one, of course, is rising incomes. What we have seen over the last 50 years is that incomes throughout the world, including the lower developed countries, including the very poor countries, has actually increased. This has a very important impact on diet diversification. We've moved away from staple foods. And one of the things that we know, I'm being an economist, one of the things that we look at is something called Engel's curve, which means the more you earn as a percentage, the less you spend on food, but the amount you spend on food increases, and also the type of foods you buy changes. We find huge shifts in urbanization. People are moving away from farming communities, from rural lands, to more urbanization, to more urbanized communities. Again, this changes the needs of food. We also find something wonderful. We find the creation, or the widespread creation, of a nuclear family. 2 parents, both working, very little time for actually cooking, so processed foods becomes a major issue. In fact, in Dubai, 14% of our food exports actually is processed foods. And again, the very good reasons for this, because the opportunity cost, leisure becomes very valuable. And when leisure becomes valuable, you want to buy in a lot of the processed foods. Technology. We've heard this morning about some of the technological advancements that allows food to be exported all across the world. Improvements in logistics management, and of course globalization. Every country is now integrated into the global market. And of course trade liberalization, which I shall talk more about later in my presentation. This is a very simple map of one of the most important food commodities, wheat. Okay? And what do we find? Out of the 107 countries there, you'll actually find that there are only 5 or 6 countries which are the hubs, which are actually the wheat exporting countries. The rest of these countries are actually importing countries. Now, another very important trend that emerges here is that of this again, now this is a much wider picture. This includes all agro-based foods. For 207 countries, it has 10,696 different chains, product chains or trade chains. And the whole idea behind this is again to show the bulk of where the food originates from. And what you find is the rest of the countries in this web are actually importing countries. There is one exception here. The one exception is the re-export market. Okay? You find very, very large re-exporters. One of the interesting things is you find Netherlands is quite important here. But Netherlands is not a very large agro-based economy, but it's a great re-export market. Again, Dubai is the world's 3rd largest re-export center. So again, you find Dubai being featured here. So what role does food regulations play in the global trade? Well, one of the things that we find is that all countries are highly integrated into the global marketplace. We find that the private sector is the most important or most dominant player. Of course, in many countries, you find governments purchase food, again, as part of their social development program. We also find that the food regulation tends to be a government-based jurisdiction. And the other thing that we find is that there's a lot of concern regarding safety and the idea that food control or food regulations are a public good. Okay? What are the major trends? I think I don't need to repeat some of the issues that have been taking place in the UK, and not just limited to the UK, where a lot of contaminated food entered the food chain. It originated from one country, re-exported from another country, processed in the UK and sold around the world. So there's a lot of concern now about food safety and what are the food awareness. Again, there's a debate about obesity, and of course I'm not one of them, based on diet and health, okay? And what are the issues there? Quality control. We heard this morning about traceability. Traceability seems to be a keen issue in terms of agro standards. The idea that from field to fork, everything is traceable. The idea that we also need third-party audits, third-party certifications. And again, when we come to country of origin, this becomes very important when we have free trade agreements and also the amount of import duties you need to pay. As far as agri-food standards are concerned, there are 3 real main levels. Mandatory ones, which are internationally based, voluntary ones, and we'll hear later on today about the ISO ones, and of course private sector ones. The private sector ones originate from supermarkets wanting to set up a particular standard in order to capture a larger market share. And of course there are overlaps between these 3. What really concerns us are the mandatory ones. Okay? Now, this is where the problem occurs. On the one hand, food regulation is important because you want to have safety and assurance. On the other hand, you find that food regulation actually becomes a hindrance as far as exports are concerned, because each country has its own regulations. Exporters have to produce various different types, various different quantities. It makes it very inefficient. It also acts as a barrier to trade. So how do you overcome this? Well, I won't talk more about this, but working for Export Promotion Agency and part of the government of Dubai, our role is actually to promote exports. And one of the things that we work along is the idea that there are international bodies. One very, very important international body is, of course, as far as trade is concerned and the regulation of food is concerned, is WTO. Under the WTO framework, because the WTO looks after two things. First, the idea of international coordination, and secondly, you have the idea of dispute resolution. So within the WTO, you have two very, very important aspects. One of them is called sanitary and psychosanitary standards, and the other ones are technical barriers to trade. Now, why do we need technical barriers to trade? I've still got some time, right? Okay, I'll rush through the rest. So why do we need technical barriers to trade? Well, the whole idea behind regulations is that many countries use regulations as a way of hindering imports. And what the WTO framework seeks to do is to place certain requirements so that regulations do not stop imports, but actually are there for a particular purpose. I'll just miss some of the slides because I want to go ahead. Then we have issues to do with sanitary and psychosanitary. Now, the whole idea behind this is safety, safety of humans. In fact, Article 20 of GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, actually lays down that governments have the right to ensure the safety of humans, animals, and plant life. Okay? And this is where the SPS regulations come in. So any trade agreement you'll see, there'll be a whole section on SPS. And what does SPS seek to do? It actually seeks to put into place regulations that seek the safety, but at the same time are not an hindrance to trade taking place. Now, I'll just briefly take a few more seconds by talking about trade regulation or trade liberalization. One of the things that WTO tends to do is liberalize trade markets by not necessarily harmonizing standards, but by creating an equivalency system. And one of the problems of that is you have a lot of coordination, a lot of discussions, and one of the disadvantages or one of the weaknesses of the WTO is it takes many, many years for standards to be globally accepted. Okay? But in order to avoid this, what countries do is they actually enter into free trade agreements or a customs union, such as the GCC. And the whole idea here is to reduce or to actually harmonize a lot of the import regulations so that it's easier for exporters to enter and penetrate foreign markets. Thank you.
Thanks very much.